On the outskirts of an affluent suburban neighborhood called Willow Creek Estates, a place where perfectly trimmed hedges lined. Every sidewalk and smug smiles adorned the faces of its residents. There lived a young man named Armin. At 22, Armin was the son of a humble mechanic, who had left him nothing but an old pickup truck and the tiny, worn-out house that barely clung to the edge of the community. His clothes were simple, his shoes scuffed, and his pockets often empty, but his spirit burned with quiet determination. Unfortunately, in a world built on appearances, the residents of Willow Creek saw none of his potential, only his lack. The Homeowners Association, led by the ever-arrogant chairman Gregory Harlow, had made it their unspoken mission to remind Armin that he did not belong. Gregory was a man who loved power more than fairness. His tailored suits, silver cufflinks, and gleaming Mercedes symbolized everything he worshipped about himself. With him were his circle of loyal sycophants. Linda, the gossiping realtor who treated poor people like contagious diseases. Marcus, the retired lawyer whose arrogance could choke a room. And Evelyn, the HOA treasurer, a woman who believed that wealth alone defined morality. They had bullied Armin relentlessly, complaining about his ugly home, mocking the old truck parked in his driveway, and whispering during meetings that he was lowering property values.
Found a spark of hope. Though thoroughly broken months earlier, they began quietly feeding information to Armin's enemies, desperate to free themselves from his reign if he fell. Zara noticed the weight pressing on Armin's shoulders. Once the unshakable monarch of Willow Creek, he now spent long nights in his office, his face lit by the cold glow of screens filled with financial reports and legal filings. "They want me to crack," he said one night, his voice low, his eyes tired but burning with defiance. "They want me to be the scared boy they threw out a decade ago. But I've been forged by humiliation. They'll have to do more than this to break me." Yet, even as he said it, he felt the ghosts of the past whispering, memories of that night when Gregory humiliated him, the laughter, the shame. The vengeance that once fueled him now felt like chains around his neck, pulling him deeper into a war with no end. Things escalated when one of Victor's allies arranged a city hearing to revoke Armin's development rights in Willow Creek. The entire neighborhood turned out, not to support him, but to watch in anxious silence. Reporters filled the courtroom, cameras flashing as prosecutors accused Armin of building his empire on predatory acquisition tactics. For a moment, it seemed the wolves had finally cornered him. But Armin was no longer the poor boy begging for mercy. He was the man who had learned to weaponize his pain. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't hire a lawyer to read a carefully crafted defense. He stood up himself and addressed the room with a commanding voice. He told his story, how he'd been humiliated, thrown out, mocked, and how he fought his way back with grit and vision. He admitted he was ruthless, but challenged anyone to deny his accomplishments. The jobs he created, the lives he improved, the scholarships he funded. "They call me a tyrant," he said, staring directly into the cameras. "But when I was powerless, where were these voices of morality? Where were they when I was laughed at and discarded like garbage? If power makes me guilty, then I stand guilty. But I will never apologize for surviving." His speech went viral, turning public opinion in his favor almost overnight. But Armin knew the battle wasn't over. His enemies were too entrenched to back down because of a single speech. Behind the scenes, Victor's faction planned one final strike, a hostile takeover of Armin's logistics empire that would bankrupt him. Gregory, driven by cowardice and desperation, provided confidential information that gave them an edge. When Zara discovered the betrayal, she wanted to destroy Gregory on the spot, but Armin stopped her. "Let him," Armin said with a cold smile. "Sometimes you have to let the knife come close before you break it." With meticulous cunning, Armin set a trap. Using shell companies and anonymous investors, he created the illusion that his empire was weaker than it actually was, luring Victor's faction into overextending themselves on the takeover bid. When they struck, Armin unleashed his counterattack. He exposed their insider trading, leaked recordings of their illegal collusion, and used his hidden reserves to buy back shares at rock-bottom prices while they scrambled in panic. The move not only saved his empire, but nearly bankrupted his enemies. Victor fled the country amid scandal. Gregory and the traitors were left trembling. Armin didn't scream at Gregory or seek overt revenge. His punishment was colder. He summoned Gregory to his mansion and said only one sentence: "You're free." Gregory blinked, confused. "Free?" Armin nodded. "You don't owe me your house. You don't owe me your service. Leave Willow Creek. Tonight. If you ever set foot here again, I'll bury you legally and financially." And so Gregory left, his departure silent and pitiful, a man destroyed not by vengeance, but by his own cowardice. When the dust settled, Armin stood victorious again, but it didn't feel like victory. The residents of Willow Creek now looked at him with a strange mix of reverence and fear, and even Zara saw the toll etched on his soul. One evening, as they stood under the night sky, she asked, "Was it worth it? All this pain, all this war?" Armin didn't answer directly. He looked out over the glowing streets of Willow Creek, the same streets where he had once been humiliated, and whispered, "I don't know if revenge brings peace, but it makes sure no one ever laughs at you again." And deep down, he wondered if the boy he once was would even recognize the man he had become. But the story was far from over, and Armin knew larger battles, and perhaps a reckoning with himself, still lay ahead.
The following morning after his shocking return, the once proud residents of Willow Creek awoke to the sound of an unfamiliar order. Notices had been slipped under every door, bearing the new HOA emblem. A sleek black crest with the letter A embossed in gold. At the bottom, a name burned into their minds: Armin Khan, chairman and sole owner of Willow Creek Estates. The letter was simple, yet chilling. All prior HOA rules are null and void. A mandatory community meeting will be held tonight. Attendance is not optional. Whispers fill the air as neighbors who once mocked him peeked nervously through their curtains. At dusk, the entire community gathered in the clubhouse, the same hall where they had once jeered and laughed at him. This time, silence ruled the room as Armin walked in flanked by two sharply dressed executives and a legal advisor. His presence was commanding, a man carved by fire and success, every step deliberate. Gregory stood at the front, sweat beading on his brow, clutching papers like a man trying to hold on to a crumbling crown. Armin took the podium without asking, his deep voice cutting through the stale air. 10 years ago, I stood here and begged for compassion. You gave me humiliation. Tonight, I stand here not as your neighbor, but as your owner. And I promise you, things are about to change. Gasps rippled. Gregory, desperate, tried to assert himself. This isn't how things work. The HOA is a democracy. You can't just... He froze when Armin slammed a folder on the table, revealing ownership documents and debt contracts. Read them, Armin said coldly. I own your debts, your mortgages, and your HOA charter. Legally and financially, I control Willow Creek. You can leave if you want, but you'll owe me every cent I invested, and I will collect. The silence was suffocating. The residents felt the ground beneath them shifting. For the first time, Gregory looked small, like a dethroned king. Linda attempted her old, condescending charm. Armin, darling, surely we can find a... Armin's glare silenced her mid-sentence. You call me trash, Linda. I heard every word back then. You said I'd never amount to anything. Now, you'll follow my code, or you'll find yourself living in a trailer park. He then turned to Evelyn, the treasurer who once mocked his father's debts. You laughed when my father's house was auctioned. I bought the company that owns your pension fund. Cross me, and you'll have nothing left to retire on. A murmur of shock traveled through the crowd. This wasn't just revenge. It was a surgical dismantling of their pride. Armin continued, outlining his new rules. Every property must meet my new community standards. There will be monthly contributions to a development fund I control. Those who mistreated me will repay their debt in humility. Gregory, Marcus, Linda, Evelyn, you will resign and serve as my compliance officers for the next 5 years. You will enforce my rules door to door. Refuse, and you lose your homes. Gregory's mouth opened, then shut. The man who once humiliated Armin was now trembling. Marcus, who had once laughed the loudest, muttered, "This is madness." Armin leaned in close. "No, this is justice. The world you created had no mercy for the weak. Don't expect mercy now that the roles are reversed." The room remained silent, the weight of his words pressing down like a storm. Days turned into weeks, and the new regime of Willow Creek took shape. Armin moved into the grandest home, the very mansion Gregory once owned. Now, Gregory lived 2 streets down, demoted from king to servant, his pride swallowed as he knocked on doors enforcing Armin's mandates. Residents whispered behind closed doors, but none dared challenge him openly. The neighborhood transformed, parks were renovated, homes repainted, streets repaired, but all bore Armin's insignia. Every improvement served as a reminder. The man they once mocked was now the architect of their lives. At community meetings, residents sat silently as Armin laid out directives with an iron hand. He invited business tycoons and city officials to parties in the clubhouse, events where Willow Creek residents served as staff. The same people who had sneered at his unworthiness now carried trays and poured champagne, their humiliation complete. But Armin wasn't driven purely by cruelty. His vengeance was precise, aimed only at those who wronged him most. He funded scholarships for poor kids outside Willow Creek, ensuring no one else would suffer his fate. Yet for Gregory, Linda, Marcus, and Evelyn, there was no escape from the weight of their past sins. Gregory's wife left him, unable to handle the shame. Linda's real estate firm collapsed after Armin exposed her fraudulent dealings. Marcus, the once proud lawyer, was seen mowing Armin's lawn as part of his compliance duties, the ultimate humiliation. Evelyn begged for forgiveness after her retirement fund was frozen under Armin's control. Each humiliation was poetic, each act of revenge a calculated echo of their past cruelty. And still, Armin remained calm, never shouting, never gloating. His silence and composure made their suffering worse. The community began to revere him out of fear and respect. Parents warned their children, "Never mock the poor. You don't know who they'll become." Even those who hadn't wronged him felt the weight of his authority. He had turned Willow Creek into his empire of redemption and revenge, a living monument to the idea that power remembers pain. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Gregory approached Armin outside the mansion, his voice trembling. "Why are you doing this? Haven't you hurt us enough?" Armin looked out over the neighborhood, his eyes reflecting both pain and power. "You think this is about hurt? This is about balance. You all taught me that the world respects power, not kindness. I believed you. Now, you live by your own lesson." He walked away, leaving Gregory standing under the cold night air, haunted by the truth. But even as Willow Creek bowed under Armin's iron hand, not everyone was willing to accept their new reality in silence. Beneath the surface of quiet compliance, resentment simmered. A small faction of residents began whispering in hushed voices late at night, gathering in dimly lit living rooms and shadowed backyards, away from Armin's surveillance and legal grip. Gregory, humiliated beyond recognition, had become the reluctant figurehead of this group, not out of courage, but out of desperation. He could not bear the sight of his former mansion, now lit up with Armin's extravagant parties, where the elite of the city toasted to the self-made king. Linda, her fortune gone, sat beside him, hatred etched into her aging features. "We can't live like this," she hissed one night. "He's making us slaves in our own homes. There has to be a way to take him down." Marcus, once arrogant, now gaunt and bitter, leaned forward. "He's too powerful legally, but power can be destabilized. People like him have enemies." The group's plan was simple but dangerous. Find those who hated Armin outside Willow Creek and feed them information to weaken his empire. They began reaching out anonymously to rival businessmen, discontent former partners, and even a few corrupt officials. Meanwhile, Armin, ever perceptive, sensed the shifting air. He had learned long ago that victory makes people bold, that humiliation curdles into rebellion if left unchecked. His assistant, a sharp strategist named Zara, brought him reports of late-night meetings and whispers. "They're too scared to act openly," she said one evening in his study. "But fear can be unpredictable." "How far do you want me to go?" Armin's gaze turned cold. "Let them plot. Let them believe they have hope. When they strike, we'll be ready, and they'll learn the cost of betrayal." Weeks passed, and the rebels grew bolder. An anonymous letter appeared in the city's gossip columns accusing Armin of predatory financial practices. Flyers circulated in nearby communities painting him as a tyrant. A city council member, secretly bribed by Gregory's faction, attempted to push for an investigation into Armin's acquisitions. But Armin's empire wasn't built on sand. It was fortified by foresight. He exposed the council members' corruption before the investigation even began, leaving the man disgraced and jobless. He traced the anonymous letters back to Linda and Marcus, confronting them not with fury, but with unnerving calm. One stormy night, he summoned the rebel faction to the clubhouse under the pretense of a community discussion. They arrived nervously, unaware that Armin had filled the room with key allies, lawyers, investors, even the mayor, all loyal to him. When Gregory and the others tried to speak, Armin silenced them with a single gesture. "You think I don't know your every move? You think you can destroy what I built?" His voice was quiet, almost gentle, but the weight behind it made the room tremble. 10 years ago, you laughed as you tore down a man who had nothing. Today, you scheme against a man who owns everything you see. If you want war, I'll give you war, but understand this, you will not survive it. Then, with calculated precision, he revealed a bombshell that crushed their rebellion completely. He had acquired not only the HOA and their debts, but also controlling stakes in the companies that provided their utilities, their mortgages, and even Gregory's pitiful new job. With a few signatures, he could evict them, cut their power, and freeze their assets. The rebels sat frozen, the thunder outside echoing their terror. Armin leaned closer to Gregory, his eyes like steel. "I gave you the chance to serve me with dignity. You spat on it. This is your final warning. You live by my rules, or you live on the street. Choose." After that night, no one dared whisper against him again. The failed rebellion became a cautionary tale whispered in trembling voices. Parents warned their children, never cross Armin Khan. The man who once slept in a truck now controlled lives like a chess master. And yet, amid his vengeance, there were flickers of something else, moments when his hardened mask cracked. One evening, Zara found him alone on his balcony, staring at the streets below where kids rode bikes, laughing the way he once had before humiliation poisoned his world. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "if revenge can ever be enough?" Armin didn't answer right away. His eyes reflected the glow of the streetlights. "It's not about enough," he said finally. "It's about memory. They made sure I never forgot what it felt like to be powerless. I'm making sure they never forget who I became." Still, even he felt the gnawing truth. Power was intoxicating, but it was also isolating. He had no true friends in Willow Creek, only fearful subjects. The women who once mocked his poverty now tried to flirt with him. The men who sneered now bowed. But he trusted none of them. His empire was built on respect forged in fear, not love. And yet, the story of Armin Khan was far from over. Outside of Willow Creek, the whispers of his ruthless rise caught the attention of powerful figures, business rivals, and political enemies who didn't care about HOA grudges but cared deeply about power. In their eyes, Armin was a threat. As his dominance grew, so did the forces assembling against him. And deep inside Armin's heart, though he wouldn't admit it, the question Zura asked lingered like a shadow. Would the boy who was humiliated ever find peace, or was he doomed to rule forever from a throne built of revenge? As months rolled by under Armin's dominion, Willow Creek transformed into an immaculate symbol of his victory. Every home gleamed, every hedge was manicured, every street bore the weight of his name. But outside its gates, the world was watching. The story of the boy who had been humiliated by an HOA and returned to own the entire neighborhood spread like wildfire in business circles and the media. Some hailed him as a symbol of grit and triumph. Others whispered of him as a ruthless tyrant with a taste for humiliation. Among those whispers were powerful men and women whose empires dwarfed Willow Creek, but who felt threatened by Armin's rise. One such figure was Victor Kane, a billionaire developer notorious for crushing his rivals with hostile takeovers. To him, Armin was an upstart, an ambitious wolf who needed to be caged before he expanded further. Through intermediaries, Victor began probing for weaknesses, secret audits of Armin's companies, offers to buy off his employees, quiet pressure on city regulators to investigate him. At first, Armin treated these attempts with calm disdain. He had faced worse storms. But when Zara came to him late one night with a report that Willow Creek's development fund had been hacked and drained of millions, Armin realized this was no longer a game. Victor had crossed the line. "He thinks he can touch me where it hurts," Armin said coldly as he stared out over his empire. "Let's show him what happens when you provoke a man who's already walked through fire." The battle that followed went far beyond Willow Creek. Armin mobilized his network. Politicians who owed him favors, rival developers who hated Victor more than they feared Armin, and the media outlets hungry for scandal. Within weeks, exposés on Victor's illegal land deals dominated headlines. City inspectors raided his offices. His stock prices tumbled. Armin didn't stop there. He orchestrated a stunning takeover bid, buying out Victor's distressed assets piece by piece. It was a ruthless chess game played on a national stage, and Armin's legend only grew. Back in Willow Creek, the residents watched in awe and terror as their HOA king became a regional titan. Some even began to genuinely admire him. Others remained quietly resentful, their fear deepening as his power reached beyond their control. Gregory, now fully broken, approached Armin one evening as he stood by the fountain in the community park. "Why keep going?" Gregory asked, his voice thin. "You've won. We're humiliated. You own everything. Why not just stop?" Armin's eyes were hard as granite. "Because the world doesn't stop. The moment I pause, men like Victor Kane come for me. You all taught me that weakness invites cruelty. I will never be weak again." Gregory lowered his gaze. In that moment, he understood that Armin's revenge had grown into something bigger than the HOA. It had become his armor against a world that once laughed at him. But power has a cost, and Armin began to feel its weight. The lawsuits from Victor's allies, the constant surveillance, the enemies multiplying in the shadows, all of it pressed against him. Zara noticed the toll it took. One night in his mansion, she found him sitting alone with an old photograph. Himself as a teenager, standing by his father's tiny garage, grease-stained and smiling. "You were happier back then," she said quietly. Armin didn't look up. "Happiness is for people who don't remember humiliation," he replied. And yet, a part of him longed for the peace of those days, even as he expanded his empire further. Willow Creek itself became both his sanctuary and his stage. He hosted charity galas where billionaires dined on the same lawns where HOA members once mocked his old truck. He built a scholarship fund for poor kids in memory of his father, and the media praised him as a philanthropist. But beneath the public praise, new threats brewed. A faction of Victor's associates, men with resources and no morals, decided that if they couldn't beat Armin in business, they'd destroy him personally. Rumors began circulating about his past, twisted and exaggerated. Anonymous death threats arrived at his office. And one evening, a black SUV was spotted idling outside Willow Creek, its occupants photographing his home. Armin was no stranger to intimidation. It only hardened his resolve. But this time, he wasn't just protecting his pride. He was protecting his home, the place where his vengeance began and his empire stood. He doubled security, installed surveillance across the neighborhood, and quietly armed his private staff. The residents, once his tormentors, now felt safer under his rule than ever before. Ironically, the man they mocked as unworthy had become their shield against outside predators. And yet, Armin's soul wrestled with a question he couldn't silence. At what point does vengeance turn into tyranny? Zara voiced it one night as they watched the sunset. "You've crushed everyone who hurt you, and now you're fighting enemies you've never even met. Will you ever be free of this war?" Armin didn't answer. His silence was louder than words. The war for power had become his life. The poor boy of Willow Creek was gone forever, replaced by a man who ruled through fear, respect, and relentless will. And far beyond the neighborhood gates, powerful eyes continued watching, waiting for their chance to strike. The story of Arman Khan was only beginning to reach its darkest chapters, where revenge, justice, and ambition would collide in ways no one in Willow Creek, or even Arman himself, could yet imagine.
The storm that Arman had long anticipated finally arrived, not as a whisper, but as a roaring tempest that threatened to tear apart everything he had built. It began subtly. A key logistics contract for his company was abruptly canceled after years of smooth operations. An anonymous tip to the media sparked headlines accusing him of labor exploitation abroad, and a quiet investigation was opened by federal authorities into his rapid acquisition of Willow Creek. Individually, these would have been minor annoyances for a man of his resources, but together they signaled a coordinated attack. Victor Kane's allies had regrouped and joined forces with other enemies Arman had made along his meteoric rise. Their goal was simple: destroy the legend of Arman Khan by stripping him of his wealth, his power, and his reputation. At first, Arman reacted with his usual precision and cold strategy, deploying his legal teams, buying favorable press, and leveraging his connections to stall investigations. But the assault kept coming. An anonymous hacker leaked internal company emails, taken out of context to paint him as ruthless and corrupt. His charity foundation was accused of being a shell to launder money. Even the residents of Willow Creek began to whisper again, not in rebellion, but in fear that their king's throne might crumble. And in the shadows of these growing doubts, Gregory and the old HOA clique found a spark of hope. Though thoroughly broken months earlier, they began quietly feeding information to Arman's enemies, desperate to free themselves from his reign if he fell. Zara noticed the weight pressing on Arman's shoulders. Once the unshakable monarch of Willow Creek, he now spent long nights in his office, his face lit by the cold glow of screens filled with financial reports and legal filings. "They want me to crack," he said one night, his voice low, his eyes tired but burning with defiance. "They want me to be the scared boy they threw out a decade ago. But I've been forged by humiliation. They'll have to do more than this to break me." Yet, even as he said it, he felt the ghosts of the past whispering, memories of that night when Gregory humiliated him, the laughter, the shame. The vengeance that once fueled him now felt like chains around his neck, pulling him deeper into a war with no end. Things escalated when one of Victor's allies arranged a city hearing to revoke Arman's development rights in Willow Creek. The entire neighborhood turned out, not to support him, but to watch in anxious silence. Reporters filled the courtroom, cameras flashing as prosecutors accused Arman of building his empire on predatory acquisition tactics. For a moment, it seemed the wolves had finally cornered him. But Arman was no longer the poor boy begging for mercy. He was the man who had learned to weaponize his pain. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't hire a lawyer to read a carefully crafted defense. He stood up himself and addressed the room with a commanding voice. He told his story, how he'd been humiliated, thrown out, mocked, and how he fought his way back with grit and vision. He admitted he was ruthless, but challenged anyone to deny his accomplishments. The jobs he created, the lives he improved, the scholarships he funded. "They call me a tyrant," he said, staring directly into the cameras. "But when I was powerless, where were these voices of morality? Where were they when I was laughed at and discarded like garbage? If power makes me guilty, then I stand guilty. But I will never apologize for surviving." His speech went viral, turning public opinion in his favor almost overnight. But Arman knew the battle wasn't over. His enemies were too entrenched to back down because of a single speech. Behind the scenes, Victor's faction planned one final strike, a hostile takeover of Arman's logistics empire that would bankrupt him. Gregory, driven by cowardice and desperation, provided confidential information that gave them an edge. When Zara discovered the betrayal, she wanted to destroy Gregory on the spot, but Arman stopped her. "Let him," Arman said with a cold smile. Sometimes you have to let the knife come close before you break it. With meticulous cunning, Armin set a trap. Using shell companies and anonymous investors, he created the illusion that his empire was weaker than it actually was, luring Victor's faction into overextending themselves on the takeover bid. When they struck, Armin unleashed his counterattack. He exposed their insider trading, leaked recordings of their illegal collusion, and used his hidden reserves to buy back shares at rock-bottom prices while they scrambled in panic. The move not only saved his empire, but nearly bankrupted his enemies. Victor fled the country amid scandal. Gregory and the traitors were left trembling. Armin didn't scream at Gregory or seek overt revenge. His punishment was colder. He summoned Gregory to his mansion and said only one sentence: "You're free." Gregory blinked, confused. "Free?" Armin nodded. "You don't owe me your house. You don't owe me your service. Leave Willow Creek tonight. If you ever set foot here again, I'll bury you legally and financially." And so Gregory left, his departure silent and pitiful, a man destroyed not by vengeance, but by his own cowardice. When the dust settled, Armin stood victorious again, but it didn't feel like victory. The residents of Willow Creek now looked at him with a strange mix of reverence and fear, and even Zara saw the toll etched on his soul. One evening, as they stood under the night sky, she asked, "Was it worth it? All this pain, all this war?" Armin didn't answer directly. He looked out over the glowing streets of Willow Creek, the same streets where he had once been humiliated, and whispered, "I don't know if revenge brings peace, but it makes sure no one ever laughs at you again." And deep down, he wondered if the boy he once was would even recognize the man he had become. But the story was far from over, and Armin knew larger battles, and perhaps a reckoning with himself, still lay ahead. After Gregory's departure, Willow Creek entered a strange calm, almost eerie in its perfection. The lawns glistened like emerald carpets, the fountains sparkled under moonlight, and every resident carried themselves with quiet submission, as if fearful that even a whisper of complaint might summon Armin's wrath. But for Armin himself, the empire he had forged with vengeance began to feel like a gilded cage. He had achieved what most would call impossible: wealth beyond imagination, control over those who mocked him, victory against rivals who sought his destruction. Yet, in the quiet hours of the night, the boy inside him still saw flashes of that fateful evening years ago. The jeers, the public humiliation, the sting of being told he was unworthy. These memories had fueled his rise, but now they haunted him with a different question. Had he built his life solely around revenge? And if so, what remained when revenge was complete? Zara sensed the storm within him. She had been by his side through every battle, and though she admired his brilliance, she feared what relentless war had done to his soul. One evening, she found him standing alone at the old community hall, the very place where his humiliation had begun. "Do you ever feel," she asked gently, "that the boy who stood here that night is still waiting for an apology that will never come?" Armin didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the empty stage. "No," he said quietly. "That boy died the night they left. What stands here now is someone else." But even as he said it, his voice betrayed the pain beneath the armor. Beyond Willow Creek, however, darker storms brewed. Victor Kane's fall had created a power vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped figures far more dangerous. One was Dmitry Volkov, a shadowy investor with rumored ties to organized crime, a man who believed in settling disputes not in courts but with bullets. Another was Amelia Cross, a cunning heiress and media mogul who saw Armin's meteoric rise as both a threat and an opportunity. Together, they began weaving a plot that would strike not just at Armin's empire, but at his life. It started subtly again, anonymous threats escalating into attempts to bribe his closest employees, financial sabotage that even Armin struggled to contain. But then came a night that shattered his illusion of invincibility. As he returned to his mansion one late evening, his car was ambushed on the private road into Willow Creek. A black SUV blocked his path, and masked gunmen opened fire. His driver swerved and accelerated, bullets tearing into the night. Armin survived, But the message was clear. His war had crossed a line, and his enemies were no longer playing corporate games. That night, Zara confronted him with fury and fear. "This can't go on forever, Armin. You've turned yourself into a target for every vulture who smells power. How much longer before one of them succeeds?" Armin, blood still on his sleeve from the shattered glass, stared out at the neighborhood he once vowed to conquer. "They think fear will break me," he said coldly. "They've forgotten I was forged in fear." His words were steel, but deep inside, he wondered if his own thirst for dominance had invited this darkness. Rather than retreat, Armin escalated. He hired elite security not just for himself, but for the entire neighborhood, turning Willow Creek into a fortress. Surveillance cameras lined every corner, guards patrolled the streets, and any outsider was vetted with military precision. The residents, those who once mocked him, now looked to him as their protector against unseen threats. Ironically, the man they once called unworthy had become the only shield between them and a world that wanted to destroy everything he built. But protection came with a price. Armin imposed even stricter rules, consolidated even more control, and in doing so, some residents began whispering again. This time not about rebellion, but about fear of the darkness consuming their king. Meanwhile, Dmitri and Amelia's plot deepened. They infiltrated the media with damning stories about Armin's dictatorship over Willow Creek, painting him as a villain who exploited his community. Protesters appeared outside his city offices. Rival companies refused to do business with him. The empire trembled, not from bullets this time, but from the slow poison of public opinion and shadowy alliances. Yet Armin refused to be cowed. He launched his own media offensive, revealing Dmitri's criminal ties and Amelia's history of corporate fraud. It became a war fought on all fronts: legal, financial, psychological. But amid the chaos, Armin began to feel something he hadn't felt in years: exhaustion. Nights became longer, trust became rarer, and even Zara worried that the war might consume the last remnants of the boy she once saw fixing cars with his father. One night, after yet another emergency meeting with his security team, Armin walked alone through Willow Creek Central Park. The air was cool, the sky littered with stars. He stopped by the same bench where he once sat, poor and broken, while Gregory and the others mocked him. Now he was the king of this kingdom, but as he sat there, he felt strangely hollow. A young boy rode past on a bicycle, laughing with pure, untainted joy. Armin closed his eyes and wondered when he had last felt anything like that. Zara's words from weeks earlier echoed in his mind. Will you ever be free of this war? He didn't know the answer. He only knew that the war wasn't over. Dmitri and Amelia were closing in, and the final chapters of his saga would be written not just in boardrooms and courtrooms, but in blood if necessary. As he rose from the bench, the stars above seemed to whisper of an inevitable reckoning, one that would test not just his empire, but his very soul. And somewhere deep inside, Armin felt a stirring he had buried for years, the faintest glimmer of a desire not for revenge, not for power, but for peace. Whether he would ever find it, or whether the darkness he unleashed would consume him first, remained a question only the battles ahead could answer.